Got to connect. Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our final Zoom talk in our series of Monday night talks. This is our 12th Zoom talk, which is a pretty great achievement. And thank you all for coming with me on this journey. And welcome to newcomers as well. And I'm sorry you're joining in right at the end. But we're really glad to have you all here. So tonight, Stephen and I are going to do a bit of a presentation on what we've learned so far in our series, and also Stephen's going to talk about Stephanie Kelton's book, which has just arrived from our orders, and I've got a couple of copies here left, which will give you all the information about. Stephen's got two different ones up there. But before we kick off, I'd like to just first acknowledge that and pay our respects to the First Nations people on whose stolen land we live and work, and on whose land we are meeting tonight. I'm here on Kaurna land on the Adelaide Plains. A number of you are up in the hills on Paramount country. If you'd like to put your acknowledgement into the chat, if you're on somebody else's land, that would be a really kind gesture. And I'd just like to say we acknowledge First Nations people's wisdom in caring for the land and the particular grief that they're feeling right now with what's going on in the world, and also with the relentless damage to country that's being done by climate change and global warming, which is a product of colonisation. So I'll hand over now to Stephen, and he can start the slideshow.
Well, sort of hand over to me, because it's the two of us are going to do this together, and I hope people will join in as we go. I haven't prepared a formal talk or anything. It is going to involve going back, not just over the last 12 weeks really, but I was thinking earlier today what Gabby and I and Phil and Paul and others were thinking about a year ago. Do you remember planning for the conference, Gabby?
Yep. It seems like such a long time. We've just come out of the election, and we knew that we wanted to do something that brought together jobs and climate action. That was our starting point.
Yeah. I wanted to see the leading MMT economists, if we could get them here. We would have had Randy Ray as well as Warren on the video, and Bill and Stephanie, were it not for the fact that Randy's wife couldn't get a visa in time. And I also wanted some of Phil's mates, the leading ecological economists. We wanted to get them in one place, and trade unionists and activists and members of the public. And this is really what we wanted to do, rethinking capitalism. We wanted to get all those people together in one place and start thinking about the kind of future that we would like to build, and how it would be different to what we'd had in the past, and how we might go about doing it. And it was great that everybody came. And it was an unforgettable experience for both of us, really, because we were worried whether we'd get 50 people. Do you remember?
Yes.
Terrified. And we got 400. So that was the start of something. And then what did you have planned after the conference, Gabby? Not this.
No, not this. Well, after the conference, we started an action group. And I should say, like, the conference, it seems such a long time ago now, and it was just a kind of perfect coming together of a whole bunch of things. I've got to say, it's probably one of the most important things I've done in my life. And
me too.
Thank Stephen for, being the brains of the operation, and also Paul and Phil, who both helped. And just say how proud I am of all of us that we actually pulled it off. Anyway, enough of the glorifying the past. So after the conference, we decided that we should form an action group and start getting this message out and talking to community leaders and councils and people who are in positions of influence in the union movement and in other groups about, just inspiring them about the idea of a job guarantee, that we could pay for it. We know how the financial side of it would work. We have the answers to those questions, and it is possible, which is something that people have been kind of brainwashed out of thinking of, big ideas because of the how do you pay for it question. So after, we kind of got going. We had a bunch of projects and ideas in the pipeline, and then we all needed to hit the pause button on those types of events. Public forums in particular are not going to be happening while the coronavirus is a danger to us. So at the last, when it became clear that we couldn't do those things, or at least couldn't do them yet, I just decided, kind of on the spur of the moment really, that we should have a Zoom catch up every Monday night, and we should learn something from somebody. And that was the basis of what we've done. And 12 weeks later, here we are. So this is the,
here we are.
Yeah. This is the list of our talks, and I'd like to just go through it, and I'd love people to either put in the chat or perhaps unmute themselves and say something about what stood out for them for each of these.
Could I just say, why have we got some of them in red? Don't want Warwick to feel left out.
Yeah.
The ones in red were at the conference, of course. David and Tim played a very active role there, and the other people there were speakers at the conference. Kate was at the conference too. Dan was there as well as an attendee. So it has been an extension of January, really. Anyway, go on. Sorry.
Yeah, with a few new people thrown in.
Yeah.
So does anybody remember way back to the 30th of March, our very first talk? Where Lachlan was speaking about how important it is to make sure that we're reaching out to the unions and to the labour movement, the labour people who are in the working groups and the policymakers who are on our side with these things.
Could I just say how important Lachlan's been?
Absolutely.
First of all, for the conference. Secondly, as far as I'm concerned, he's got me gigs speaking at the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet and various other things. And at the moment, it's as much Lachlan as anybody else that's behind Stephanie's various Australian engagements. At the Australia Institute on Wednesday, I hope everybody's going to come along and listen on Wednesday night. That's going to be amazing. And there'll be other events with her too.
Yeah, we'll post the details for that very soon.
He's going to be Prime Minister one day. I just hope I live long enough to see it. Yes. Anyway, sorry, go on.
No, you're absolutely right. He is such a mover and shaker, and he, he really works so hard to get these ideas out there and to talk to people. And he was another one who was one of the people without whom the conference would not have happened.
Could I just say, Stephen, I'm sorry to disagree with you, but he's only going to be Deputy Prime Minister because Gabby's going to be Prime Minister.
Well, I think they'll be on opposite sides probably, because by then the country will have realised the disaster that the Liberals are, and there'll be the Greens on one side and the Labour Party on the other. So they'll be bitter opponents of each other, I expect, actually. With a bit of luck. Anyway, agree.
I'd happily be deputy to Lachlan. So our second talk, we had Cameron Murray, and he talked about housing, and that came up, in a big way with the lack of what the federal government is doing to do anything to solve the housing crisis. that's been on our minds pretty much the whole, all through the crisis, you know, trying to find emergency accommodation for people who are homeless, and just thinking, gosh, there's got to be a better way. Was very great to have Cameron, and he is also, of course, one of the co-authors of the other book that we distributed out, Game of Mates, and that is on my mind a lot too. Every time you see something like this appalling thing that's happened with the Victorian Labor Party and the branch stacking and that sort of thing going on, it's just everywhere, and you have to be so vigilant.
Yeah, and I think of Cameron when I think at the moment about the government choosing to subsidise people having a new kitchen, instead of putting resources into more social housing to address homelessness. And I also think back to Alice Clark at the conference as well, if you remember. Yes, that's something we'd like to change.
Then after Cameron, we had Kate Wiley, and she gave us a talk about climate medicine, which was one of the first ones where we actually had a slide presentation, and I can remember thinking, wow, these slides are so good. And then she said that they were available for use on her website. So just a quick reminder for everybody, if you do want to go back and look at the climate medicine resources, you can find Kate's website pretty easily by Googling. And you can also find it from our action group page where all the videos are. And she listed a number of things that we can do as individuals, eat less meat, change the way we get around, all of those things, but also more things that we can do with the, you know, investing ethically and those types of actions. So that was a really useful and thought-provoking addition to our repertoire, I think. Then after Kate, we kind of flipped back to politics, and we had Ed Miller, my Get Up colleague, and he gave us his thoughts about how we can actually achieve what we want with a People's Recovery Green New Deal for Australia. We weren't able to record Ed's talk because it was a little bit politically sensitive. But I do have the notes, actually. If anybody's interested in following that up, I'm able to share a Word document with the notes that we took from that session. Let me know. Would you like to talk about Kelly, Stephen? This is one of my favourite talks. Well, they're all my favourite, but
Kelly is one of the most impressive people I've met in a long time. And maybe maybe it sounds like we're sort of going off the point a bit, but if I could nominate someone other than Lachlan and Gabby to be Prime Minister, how about having a First Nations woman as the Prime Minister of Australia? Everything Kelly has to say is, you know, dripping in wisdom. And it was marvellous to have her and Tyson in January. Going back a year, we wanted First Nations involvement near the beginning of the conference, and I don't want this to sound wrong, but I didn't want it to seem like we were doing it just because people were First Nations people either. It didn't. We wanted people that had something very much to say that was relevant to the conference. And the book Sand Talk and the conversation they had was great, and it was marvellous hearing Gabby talk to Kelly. Again, I hope if we have these kind of events in the future at some stage, if someone organises them maybe once a month, that maybe we could ask Tyson and Kelly back, because we've got a lot to learn from them about sustainability and community and all those kind of things. You better be careful how you talk about the next one. I'm joking.
Where are we up to?
Warwick.
Warwick.
Yeah.
Yes, excellent. Warwick, do you want to, if you're here, would you like to give us a recap?
Not really. I can't really remember what I talked about. What did I talk about? Oh yeah, I talked about full employment. I remember. mostly I think what I talked about is the history and the demonstration of the history that, you know, we can achieve full employment if we decide to, and we prioritize it over prioritizing sort of budget surpluses or you know, sensible fiscal policy, or whatever phrase you might want to hear. That was the main lesson, how after World War II, the government committed to full employment and ran basically constant budget deficits, and what kind of became known as the post-war boom, where we had 2% unemployment for 25 years and growing material standard of living and reducing inequality. Lots of good things came out of that, and we could do it again if we chose to. That's about it.
Yeah, that's great, Warwick. And I'd just like to add that there are a lot of young economists, some of whom are professors at leading universities, who appear to be unaware of this sometimes. We, as a profession, stopped teaching economic history very much about 30 years ago. It's making a bit of a comeback now. But there was one very prominent economist who wrote an article that was very critical about Bill Mitchell in particular on The Conversation a couple of years ago, who showed that he was actually unaware that Australia had 1 to 2% unemployment. Literally didn't know. It's so important that people know what's possible and what's been done before. Some of the things, obviously, we don't want to go back and try and reproduce society as it was 50 or 60 years ago. There are lots of things that were wrong about that, and we don't have the ecological space to run our economy that way anyway. But we could get back to full employment, and we had full employment for a long time. And that was a great talk. Thank you, Warwick.
Yeah, I have to say that, don't you?
No, we're really pleased that you could come and speak for us on the webinars, because we were missing you at the conference. And yeah, it was just fantastic that we could find that space as well. And I think, did you, is there a link to your work that we should post as well, so that people can follow up if they missed it?
It's not necessarily maintained particularly well, but Reconstructing Economics is my website. Most of my writing gets either reproduced or linked to there, so it's the best collation, I think.
I'll see if I can grab that and post it a bit later on. Reconstructing, or if somebody else wants to, economics.
Yeah, it's just reconstructingeconomics.com.
.com. Fabulous. Oh, thank you. Someone's beat me to it. Great. Okay, so
Tim's here as well.
Yes, I was going to say, Tim Whiffen is here. Tim, if you're still with us, I can't see you, but I hope you are. Would you like to just give us a very quick summary of what you and David were able to speak about?
It's difficult to summarise David's wisdom in it.
It is true, yeah.
Could I just say that apart from Kelly and Warwick, the David and Tim session was the highlight of the series for me. David's wisdom, as Stephen quite rightly says, David's wisdom, his ability to locate things within an intellectual and theoretical construct was just brilliant. His articulation of how we need to articulate and communicate if we're going to affect change, which is at the heart of what interests me a lot, was probably the best I've heard, I think. Wow. And it's just an absolute highlight.
Well, that's very kind. I'll pass that on to him. I think if I were to summarize it, it would be, and I don't wish to, we're on a positive note here, but I believe David articulated just the gravity of which the problem that you guys are facing as a group that is concerned with effective change. And hopefully we raise some points on how we might constructively do that. But I think the feedback seemed to be that people felt mostly the kind of, the gravity of the challenge ahead. So perhaps it may be best described as articulating that. Yeah.
David and Tim's podcasts, other than the ones that I've been on anyway, everybody should listen to them. Every single one is a gem to listen to. And just a quick story about David. I took Stephanie down to the studio, David and Tim's studio, for a chat while she was here, and she was talking, as we know, at the conference about paying for a Green New Deal, and she had mentioned Keynes' How to Pay for the War, and also a paper by Randy Ray and somebody else about how to pay for a Green New Deal. And I saw Stephanie's face, and she was shocked, because when she sat down opposite David, he had overnight read or listened to those books, and he had taken them in and thoroughly understood the ins and outs. I don't know whether I've ever seen her as surprised sitting in a conversation as talking to David. The program's very impressive. David's a very impressive man.
By the way, Stephen, your episodes are some of amongst our most highly listened. So I'm not going to be taking any of that humility, unfortunately.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. That's very kind anyway. And then, of course, Ella came along. What a life story Ella Factor has had. And what did you learn from Ella? Tim or Gabby or anyone?
I think the main lesson I took from Ella is that to make the change that we need to make, we need to have everybody with us. So we need to broaden our movement. We need to be less snobby and less fight amongst ourselves. We need to really reach out to people who perhaps don't think like us. And I think Ella's mission is to change the Labor Party from the centre, or from being inside it. And I think she was particularly keen for other people to think about that as a way of making change as well. I've pondered that a lot. I'm not sure that I could make that leap, but I'm sure others are.
We want to change the Greens and the Labour Party, and if we can, we want to change the Liberals too. Yeah. Because, just as an example, it isn't the case that Conservatives all over the world are ecological vandals the way our Conservatives are. So if we want to drag everybody towards, yes, having a proper view of the role of the federal government and the government budget, but also, of course, at least taking climate change seriously, if not ecological issues more generally. We'd like to shift everybody. But yeah, Ella was great. And then, of course, Dan very kindly spoke to us.
Yep, and Dan shared his report, which he's released about the potential for green manufacturing and jobs in those areas, which you can find from the Centre for Future Work. Excellent institution.
It's part of the Australia Institute.
Yes, like a kind of sister site to the Australia Institute. And that has a fantastic report and a bit of a summary too. If you don't have time to read the whole 60 odd pages, you can just have a look at the summary, which is always a great resource for people, if you need to make the point that, we don't have to get rid of manufacturing. We can have manufacturing that doesn't produce carbon emissions. In fact, that's definitely down the road that we should be going down. Dan's talk is also linked on our website. Most of these talks are. Just a couple of the ones that have either politically sensitive information I've had to make the link private, so you can always message me for it if you would like to see it, and Ed's, which we weren't able to record at all, sadly.
Could I say, I'll just say about Dan as well. Before he had that job, Dan was, along with Lachlan, in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. It was Dan and Lachlan that got me to Canberra a year before. And Dan, people sometimes say, oh, the Australia Institute, do they have any MMT economists in? Particularly, people have been saying that before Wednesday. Dan understands modern monetary theory very well. And obviously he's in the Australia Institute. I missed the next one.
The next one was a bit more of an interactive session. It went for the whole 2 hours. Tori, if you're here, would you like to say what you thought of the People's Assembly?
Sure. I thought that was one of my particular highlights, because one of the things I really like to do is think about and imagine new structures and work out some of the issues that are going to come up, and, you know, do a bit of foreshadowing of how it could all work. And particularly, I mean, the volunteer sector is so enormous in Australia, and a lot of the economy has been carried on the back of unpaid domestic labour, unpaid caring, and unpaid voluntary work. And yet voluntary work is something that's, it's not the same as a substitute for paid work, it's different. So I really enjoyed the opportunity to tease that out, and to think about the way it can work, and to make a head start on working out how to get around some of the naysayers. You know, what are people likely to bring up as problems, and to show, I mean, I'm at the moment trying to do a summary paper on that we can send around to everybody. So I'm still only about halfway through it, but yeah.
And that will be useful for every time we do a forum where we are asking councils to be involved. A lot of councils have really big volunteering programs, and they're rightly proud of the role that volunteers play in the work that they do. And I think it's on us to show that a job guarantee wouldn't mean that we suddenly say to those volunteers, sorry folks, you're not needed anymore, you know, take a hike. That's the last thing we want to do. So I thought our discussion around balancing those two ideas was really useful, and will be really useful for our future work. And thank you to Tori for taking all of those threads and putting them into a summary version. I'm sure GetUp will be really interested in that, as will everybody who wants to organise more forums and talk to councils and other volunteering organisations for that matter. And thank you to Sonia, who facilitated that and organised it. And thank you to Sue for bringing it to us as an idea and setting us up with the contacts. Much appreciated, and a great kind of addition to our program. And then that takes us to the talk last week, where we had Paz from ACOS, and he was here to tell us about the campaign to keep the job seeker rate at its current levels and not let it drop back to the starvation rate of $40 a day that it had been prior to the coronavirus supplement. And it sounds like they've got a pretty good idea of where they want to go with that campaign. They're asking people to share their stories, people with lived experience. They're asking people to meet with their politicians. They're asking people to talk to their GPs about just the way their lives have changed, and the way they're able to actually afford to look after themselves better now that the job seeker rate is at a livable level. So yes, we have that recording available. If you'd like to check it out, we'll post the website, which has all the recordings that we've got available as links. And here we are. And we're about to get to why everybody tuned in tonight, which is to talk about the deficit myth. So if you've got any more reflections on our past talks as we go along today, please put them in the chat, and they can be added into the summary And thank you everyone who came along with us for one or more or all of our Zoom sessions. It's been a great ride.
Yes, it has, and as I said, it's been an extension of what's gone before, and I just jotted a few things down myself here, but I think I ought to say at this point, in the last few years, I have met two people, both women, both of whom I think are extraordinary. One of whom thinks of herself as a little person, but is not a little person at all, is a very big person and is playing a bigger role than she imagines in changing Australia, I think. Because I think we have an opportunity at the moment to shift. Well, I've already found, some of you might have heard me talking to the chief economist of ANZ recently. I've found that financial institutions are shifting their attitude towards how they think about the government budget and what we call modern monetary theory. There's a lot of interest in the Greens, various people that I've heard from in various parts of the ALP. We've had state parties passing job guarantee motions. We have had stories in the newspaper since January, especially in January, but since then about modern monetary theory, featuring Stephanie particularly. There was a big story about her in the Times of London over the weekend. Gabby, locally, is playing a big part in that. But of course, globally, the global face of modern monetary theory. And there was a reason why Phil and I and others wanted to bring the ecological economists and the modern monetary theorists together, because we need both perspectives if we're going to build a future of genuinely sustainable prosperity. And you can think about what you mean by prosperity maybe a little bit later, if we're going to rethink capitalism. And I know that David and Tim stressed how difficult this is going to be, and it is. In some ways, it's a big fight. But we have a once-in-a-lifetime chance, maybe, right now. This is the time. And the reason we have this once-in-a-lifetime chance is largely down to this other woman. And the book that she's written, The Deficit Myth. Gabby did miracles in getting loads and loads of copies to Australia that we would otherwise have had to wait for, and making it available to us and to lots of people we might want to read it, and more generally too. It is a fantastic book. One of the great experiences of my life was sitting in the Nexus 10 building in Adelaide, looking over the shoulder of Stephanie as she finished the book, and having the opportunity to, she'd say, is that word right or not? And I go, I don't know. And she'd say, what about that word? And I'd say, yeah, maybe. That was the sum total of my contribution. But it's so well written and so readable. Now, we've had a terrific modern monetary theory textbook, if you're a textbook kind of person, written by Bill Mitchell, some of you met, and Martin Watts and Randy Ray. We've got a primer about the monetary system, written by Randy Ray. There are other very academic works relating to modern monetary theory. Warren Moser wrote a popular book, but it's years out of date now. It needed updating. And Stephanie's book is at just the right time. It's written in just the right way, I think. I hope that you'll find it very difficult to put down once you start reading it. Of course, there's lots of stories from the US, but everything, virtually everything in the book applies equally to us as well. Richard Murphy is the leading English modern monetary theory economist, and I agree with every word that he's written there. And I agree with Naomi Klein too. If you've got a copy of The Deficit Myth yet, you'll pick it up soon from Gabby. There's a quote from Naomi Klein on the front cover: the tools we desperately need to build a safe future for all. Read it and then put it to use, and it's our job to help Stephanie. So what I thought I'd do is just take from each chapter. We don't have to do all the chapters. There's 8 chapters. A very short quote from Stephanie, and just ask some questions really that I don't have all the answers to. The introduction to the book is Bumper Sticker Shock. It's actually about the reason why the federal deficit wasn't big enough in the US during the global financial crisis, and the suffering that the lack of government support for Main Street during the GFC caused. And it was basically because some economists and politicians were just scared of large numbers. That was all it was down to. So there's a quote from her: "This book aims to drive the number of people who believe the deficit is a problem closer to zero. It won't be easy. It's important that we spread an understanding of the difference between the government and us, where budgeting is concerned. Now we wait for everyone in the world to change their minds. What can we all do to support Stephanie Kelton's work?" And I mentioned Bill Mitchell and Warren Mosler and Randy Ray as well, but right now Stephanie is the global face of this movement.
So that's an actual question. What can we do to support people like Stephanie? Anybody want to?
Otherwise, I'll suggest an answer, but if anybody's got anything to say.
It's Ian Carmen, Gabby and Stephen. I understand you have distributed the book to key people. Can you give an idea of who that group is?
Well, we've only just got the book, so the key people haven't got it yet. But Gabby's going to be doing this tomorrow, I think.
Yeah, so we've just started that. We've got a long list of suggestions, which is running to probably 50 plus suggestions. You know, people like Fran Kelly, Alan Kohler, down to more local ABC people who have kindly had, you know, Stephanie and Stephen on their programs.
I've given one to David Bevan, yeah.
Yeah, so we've already sent out 3 to, we sent 1 to the feed SBS. We've sent 2 to the local ABC, just because Stephen has kind of a relationship with them through being on their shows. We have sent...
Sarah?
Yes, Sarah Hanson-Young is being given one. Tony Zappia is being given one. Probably Rebecca Sharkey will be given one soon, and Michael Cornish. I've just had a suggestion for Jackie Lambie. So please, if you know Jackie Lambie or you know someone who knows Jackie Lambie, let's do it.
Lachlan's got 10, hasn't he? We're sending 10 to Lachlan.
Lachlan has been given 10 because he is a very well-connected young man, and will find excellent homes for them. There's also a guy in Melbourne who you may have met at the conference. His name is Dan Bleakley, and he's got quite a lot of contacts on Twitter and knows quite a few people too. So I sent him half a dozen.
All the people, the individuals who've ordered one, Gabby and I packed and posted a whole bunch today. So here's mine. And if you've ordered one yourself, it should be arriving in the mail fairly soon. Aha, yes.
It's probably also...
There was 2 people who slipped through the net whose orders we didn't have on the labels, but they will be getting theirs soon. But most people's book is in the postal truck as we speak, so look out for a tough bag book size coming.
But if you want one, we've still got them. We've ordered deliberately enough so that we can meet likely near-term future demand. So if you don't have a book and you want to get hold of a book that at cost price, then Gabby has stocks of The Deficit Myth. And the first thing we can all do is, I genuinely believe that if you read this book and read it again and read it a 3rd time, gradually you'll start to talk like Stephanie. And there is nobody better at communicating these ideas in a persuasive, calm, patient, inclusive way than as you'll hear on Wednesday with the Australian Institute.
Stephen, it's probably worth also mentioning that we're going to hand deliver constituents of sitting federal politicians. We're going to hand deliver, have an initial meeting with them, and then ask them to consider the book, read it, and then follow up with a further meeting in 6 or so weeks to try and then, I guess, lobby them about a job guarantee in particular. And just on that too, I've managed to establish a bit of a communication with Andrew Lee. So,
well, good luck with that one.
Yeah, I know he's going to be a hard mind to change, but anyhow, he said he would take a copy.
That's great.
Yes, we'll post the link to Wednesday morning's webinar with Stephanie Kelton as well as we go along. I'm just wrangling a couple of things here, so I've got that link ready to put in. Just give me a second. But would you like to continue?
If I can also add, I spoke to Stephanie on Sunday, and she just wanted to say to everybody how grateful she is for everything that everyone has done. I think if it was down to her family wouldn't go along. I think she'd come and live in Adelaide if she could. She absolutely loved the time she spent here, and the support that we have given, and the just Gabby doing this and us all participating in this at the moment is something Stephanie's very much aware of and very grateful for. Anyway.
Yes, we have Mark Butler. Yes, we have Jim Chalmers. We don't have Kevin Thompson, but thanks for the suggestion.
Chapter 1 is almost the same story, isn't it? You've heard me say that before. This is such an important question to get over to people. This is an issue to get over to people. Your taxes don't actually pay for anything at the federal level. The government doesn't need our money, we need their money. We've got the whole thing backwards. You remember the acronym? The STAB acronym, you spend into circulation and then you tax some of it back, and you might choose to borrow the difference. Now, does that matter? A lot of people say, oh, well, okay, sort of, you might be right about that, but we still have to have taxes, so why does it matter whether literally federal taxes pay for anything? Any ideas, Gabby?
Well, because if you're relying on taxes, then you are limited to what you can spend, because you have to force people to pay the taxes, and then you've only got that much money to spend.
Absolutely, that's one way, a very good way of looking at it. It ties government spending proposals to changes in the tax system, which is a way in which politics is very often at a stalemate in the US, where they've got into this pay-as-you-go approach to considering new fiscal proposals, except when the Republicans want to do it, and then they just ignore it. It's the Democrat side that don't. I think it matters because, amongst other things, because it reminds us that we don't need Gina Rinehart's money. We don't rely on taxes from rich people to pay for stuff. In fact, in some ways, those rich people are the problem. They've got too great a command over real resources and too much influence in our political system. It isn't the taxes of the rich that fund government services. I think once people have understood that, to me, that just transforms how you think about the role of the government in the economy. And if you want me to prove to you that this is literally true, the government, of course, in March announced that it was planning to go ahead with, 200 billion? Actually, they might end up spending 130 billion to support the economy. At that time, the amount of what we call base money, basically the money that's available to pay taxes, that existed in the economy was only 40 billion. There wasn't enough money in existence for the government to have collected the taxes in before they had engaged in the spending that they're doing at the moment, to some of it anyway, to support people during this pandemic. Anyway, that was chapter 1. Maybe we'll miss out chapter 2 because it's complicated, unless people want to ask me something about that, and move on to chapter 3.
Can I just say, I think there is a potential to talk to Juice Media. Somebody's posted that in the chat as an idea. Friendly Geordies, I have heard of that in passing, but I would have no idea how to get from me having a book here allocated to them to getting it in their hands. So if anybody can help with that, Tim said he will investigate. Thank you. Good on you, Tim.
I can tell you something about Juice Media.
Yep.
Juice Media approached me to approach Stephanie, and she is going to talk to them. I don't know when, but she's going to, they interview people sort of as a sort of podcast. Well, Stephanie's going to be one of those, I think, sometime in July or maybe August.
Fantastic. And that may lead to something. And we've certainly got plenty of copies of the book that we'll keep aside for those little opportunities as they come along.
Friendly Geordies is just one guy. So probably just directly message him, I think.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, a person like that would get thousands of messages, but I think we've got some people on the case, so that's great.
There again, the national debt. I saw Stephen Koukoulas. You know the Kouk, everyone? Good old the Kouk, former ALP economic advisor and prominent economist, of course. But can we get him to rethink anything? Until now, no. And indeed, I was tweeting with him earlier today, because he tweeted today about the national debt under the Liberals being at its record level this week, and how high the government's deficit was going to be this week, 7 billion. So I said, Stephen, relax. I said, the net money supply is at its record level this week. If it's not causing inflation, you can relax and have a glass of wine. You don't need to worry about it. And that 7 billion, that just means the government's making a net contribution to people's bank accounts this week of 7 billion. If it isn't causing inflation, it isn't a problem. You can relax. The government isn't a household. We're back to that again, really. And we sometimes say what Stephanie said here. Japan has the world's highest so-called national debt. It's something like 6 times Australia's government's relative to the size of its economy. But they could pay it off tomorrow. All it involves is pressing some keys on a keyboard. If you don't want there to be treasury bonds out there in the economy that the government's paying interest on, don't issue any. This is such a shocking thing. Stephanie reports in her book, when she was in Washington, D.C. on the Senate Budget Committee, she'd listened to these politicians, from both sides of the chamber, saying how dreadful the national debt was. And she'd say, well, does that mean you'd rather there wasn't any? And they'd say, yeah, if we had a magic wand, we'd get rid of the debt. And then she'd say, do you want to abolish treasuries? And they'd say, no, our financial system depends on them. And they literally, these politicians, had no idea that she'd just asked them the same question twice and they'd given the opposite answer. But when is a debt not a debt? The government's debt is not your or my debt. It's just dollars they've spent into the system that they haven't taxed back out of the system yet. I like to call it, and Stephanie in her book has called it, just the net money supply. And if you don't like paying interest on government bonds, it wouldn't change anything very fundamental if you didn't issue any. There just wouldn't be those government bonds available to people like the people that are looking after our superannuation funds to go and buy. But it's nothing to panic about. So when is a debt not a debt? When it's the debt of a government like our federal government with a monetary system like our monetary system. They spend their currency into the system. They're the issuer of the currency. They then, for reasons we won't dwell on now, because it always gets too complicated when we do, unless someone wants to ask, they then choose to borrow some of it back again, if you want to regard that as borrowing at all. It's nothing to panic about. I promise faithfully, however long you live, this is never going to cause a crisis in your lifetime.
And I'd just like to point out how the picture Stephen's got there, it says our national debt on the sign and your family's share of the national debt clock, and it's all big and scary. But if you just flip the script on that and you look at the title that Stephen's put at the top there, the World US Dollar Savings Account.
And just to add something else, earlier on in the year, before this pandemic, they were panicking in the US that the US government deficit might exceed $1 trillion this year. It's going to be $4 trillion. It's going to be 4 times as big as the amount that they thought was something that you needed to panic about because they've got mega numerophobia, or whatever it is Stephanie's called it in the book. It's not a debt like your debt or my debt. The government is the currency issuer. There might be reasons why they don't want to do this, but they could pay it all off tomorrow, simply using the keys on a computer. And actually, the Bank of Japan has more or less, they've done that with 50% of Japanese government debt over the last 15 years or so, because they've done a lot of what is known as quantitative easing, which means the government's bank buying back the government's debt, which has happened, of course, to a limited extent in Australia since March too. Anyway, so the government isn't a household. As long as we don't create out of control inflation, you don't need to worry about the government being in deficit, and you don't need to worry about the government's debt. It isn't like your debt or my debt at all. Indeed, it creates dollars which are then available for you and me to save, and interest which you and I can receive on our superannuation that help to tide us over in our retirement. And
Stephen, before you go on to the next one, can I just, I'm sorry I didn't flag this at the beginning for people, but we are going to have the session run on over the hour mark tonight, because we would like to go through the chapters of Stephanie's book, and we don't have a kind of formalized second hour planned. So I think just so that people know what they're in for, and I'm sorry, I should have said this at the start.
Well, we don't need to. We can finish quite quickly.
No, I think it's really important, and people will want to will want to keep going. I think people will be. I'm just aware that it's approaching 8 o'clock. So if people are happy to stay with us for a bit longer, say another 20 minutes or so past 8, then we can finish this presentation, and then just for an extra 5 minutes or so, or maybe 10, Meg and I would like to take you through what the upcoming events / dates for your diaries that we'd all like to invite you to. So please stay on the line with us if you can.
Well, in chapter 4, Stephanie discusses, and I'm sure people want to discuss each chapter in detail. I mean, you could do a whole week of a university course on each chapter of this book easily. But in chapter 4, the focus goes on to the work of a very brilliant economist. You might want to look up maybe his obituary one day. He died in 2010, called Wynne Godley, that Stephanie used to work with in New York. And his approach to thinking about the economy, and expressed at its simplest, what Wynne Godley explained is that the countries that don't have huge and persistent trade surpluses, you can't avoid a recession developing at some stage in the relatively near future, unless the government runs a deficit. Because if the government runs surpluses and the rest of the world is running a surplus with this country because this country has a trade deficit with the rest of the world. Surpluses and deficits have to cancel out on the monetary system, and that leads the private sector to be in deficit. It leads to a build-up of private debt. And in Australia under John Howard, it was household debt. Household debt trebled in the 10 years of the Howard government. We can't possibly do that again. We can't treble the level of household debt again. So if we want people to have security and people not to be in debt up to their eyeballs, and if we don't want a housing bubble, which means that young people can't afford to get anywhere to live, then we need the government to make investments in our economy, which deficit spending will continue to allow them to do in the next few years. Very significant deficit spending. But another advantage of that is that when the government runs a deficit, we get to run a surplus. So we get funds in our bank accounts that we or our other people in the private sector have not had to borrow into existence, that the government spent into existence. It's then a question of what you use those deficits for. Like I said, a government deficit is just a deposit the government's making in our banking system somewhere. Now, they can be propping up fossil fuel companies. They can be putting this money into Gina Reinhardt's bank account, encouraging her to dig more holes in the ground and, if we were talking about a coal miner, to dig up even more thermal coal that they'll then try and put some money through ARENA to pretend that they can create clean coal at some point in the future. Deficits can be used to do that, but deficit spending can also be used to support equitable full employment and to invest in green infrastructure and renewable energy and all the things we want to see happen. Anyway, just to crack on, I won't spend very long on this. The best chapter in the whole book, because there is a lot in it about what modern monetary theory has to say about low-income countries that can't borrow, where governments can't borrow in their own currencies, where there's reason to fear a currency depreciation because perhaps the country is dependent on imported food and fuel that's priced in foreign currency. Stephanie has a lot to say about that. She also has a lot to say about how countries like the US and Australia could lead the renegotiation of trade deals around the world, so that we could move from what has been the definition of free trade over the last 20 or 30 years or more towards what we might regard as fair trade, where the kinds of things we see on this screen would be part of any such agreement. And she starts off by saying, what do we need to do initially in countries like Australia and the US? We need to stop people thinking that they're losing their jobs because the country's running a trade deficit. They need to, so that they turn to someone like Donald Trump. Full employment, equitable full employment and economic security, where we don't have to engage in a fight to undermine the working conditions and wages of low-paid workers in order to engage in a race to the bottom to try and keep jobs in a global marketplace. If we can get away from that so that people have a guarantee of full employment and universal services and economic security, it just changes everything else. So I recommend people read chapter 5. Do you remember the movie 2040? Of course, that's about the not all that distant future. It still seems like a sort of Star Trek date to me, but I'm in my head it's still 1980 something. What she's talking about in chapter 6, it's quite focused on the US, but we know what the message is for us. You know, we didn't need private superannuation, tax advantage private superannuation to pay for elderly people in Australia. We can perfectly well afford a decent state pension. It's not about the money. The money's never the problem. It's about preparing to look after an aging population in a changing climate in the future. So what investments should we be making? Who should we be training? What skills do people need? And how do we give people an incentive we need to rethink how we pay the people who are caring for us when we get sick.
Do you remember what was in the movie? We had things like small scale rooftop community solar, we had seaweed kelp farming, we had putting carbon back into the soil, we had decarbonising transport.
All those things. Yeah, this chapter isn't particularly, I kind of used it as shorthand for looking at the future.
Yeah.
But absolutely. And what we need to do at the same time, we need to be building in spare capacity in our health system. We need to be ensuring that there are plenty of places in decent supportive housing and homes for the elderly when people can't look after themselves, when we can't look after ourselves anymore. We need to be investing in these things, and the people who are working in these parts of the economy, we need to be valuing them differently. We need to think about how we value people's skills and time and all those kind of things. Anyway, that's in chapter 6. Chapter 7, all right, the fiscal deficit, the government deficit taken out of context doesn't matter unless you can, you need to think about the context of the economy as a whole. If you're at full employment and there's inflation because there's too much spending beyond the production capacity of the economy, then the deficit's too high. If you're not at that point, the deficit's not too high. So one of the things I wanted to get people thinking about in January was I wanted to get away, if we could, from the growth versus degrowth debate. I wanted to say, as Stephanie does sometimes, as Kate Raworth does sometimes from a different perspective, just forget GDP. And we don't want to degrow everything. What do we want to grow? What do we want more of in the future?
Trees.
Yeah, trees. Yeah, we want good jobs, and some of those decent jobs can be decent jobs planting trees.
Affordable housing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want fast rail down the East Coast. So that people are not... Yeah, go on.
I'd love to have, when I come back from my holiday, perhaps we can see if Phil would like to talk about what he's working on in terms of ecological economics at some point.
Absolutely. Well, I know he's not just doing ecological economics. Phil is rewriting a more ambitious version of the general theory, I think, which it would be very exciting to hear about when he's. I haven't heard about it because we don't get to meet at the moment. Usually, I would have heard about what he's been working on, but it would be great later on in the year. But what we need to think about is what we want more of, because that's where that deficit spending needs to go. It needs to be invested in the future in all the things that we need more of than we have at the moment. We need a distribution system for electricity which allows us to have local renewable energy that feeds into the network better and more reliably than at the moment. The sorts of things that were being discussed by Mark Diesendorf in January. We need better, more equitable access to education in the US and healthcare. We need better public transport. If we're going back to thinking about inflation, one way of thinking about inflation, as I put on that previous slide, is to think about the constituent parts of the consumer price index. If you invest in affordable housing, if we've got renewable power which at least at a retail scale is low cost. If we have got very low cost or free public transport in the capital cities, you've gone a long way towards keeping the inflation rate down just by doing that. The notion that there's some simple link between something called the money supply and prices. Actually, for the inflation rate to go up, the prices of the things which households tend to buy have to rise more quickly. So you look at what's most important in there and you make the investments over time which will allow us to have full employment and ecological sustainability and more of the things that we want to have more of, but less of a lot of other things. Not just fossil fuels either. There are things that we need to degrow that other people are better placed to discuss than me. We need to change our whole culture, don't we, in terms of the things that we use once and throw away.
Yeah, fast fashion, plastic, tax loopholes.
One of the great problems is to, we're confused. We're focusing on means rather than ends, I agree with what you're saying, Stephen. But even what you're saying is still focusing on the means, and determining what means is necessary. First requires you to determine what the ends are and to rank them in order of importance. Then once you've worked out that, then you think, well, okay, what means do we need to achieve those ends? If it turns out that you need, renewable powered electricity grid, more public transport, so be it. And so, a lot of things you were saying, Stevie, I'm sure would be the means to the ends that matter most. But the focus on GDP, the greatest problem with that, of course, is GDP is just a means to an end. That's all it is. It's just real output. And so this focus on GDP has meant that we've focused on means and we've forgotten about the ends, the goals that matter. And so things like full employment have gone by the wayside because we seem to be more concerned with, well, a lot of people, with the rate of growth in GDP and whether, there's a narrowing income inequality seems to have gone by the wayside because people are concerned that perhaps that might get in the way of a faster rate of growth of GDP. Well, a faster rate of growth of GDP isn't much good if it's not achieving the ends that matter most to us.
Yeah.
Well, that sounds like we agree. It doesn't sound like you disagree with anything.
No, I'm not. I wasn't disagreeing with you, Steve. Because when you were focusing on means in a way, but they were directed towards what most people listening tonight and what have you, and most people generally would consider to be worthwhile ends. That's all. I just use that as a way of pointing out that, getting back to GDP, that is focused on GDP. The great problem with it is that GDP is just a means to an end, and if more GDP is not achieving the ends that matter to us, then what's the point of it? What's the point of more GDP?
Yeah.
Absolutely, exactly, which is why we should ignore it.
Let's
go
to chapter 8 because that's the last chapter, isn't it?
Okay, now here's the big one. Now we've people like Phil and I could probably tell similar stories, although not with maybe such important political figures as Stephanie and Warren tend to meet. There is a story in the book where Stephanie Kelton and Warren Mosler, they're the two people I'm pointing at with a cursor at the moment, meet Congressman Cleaver, a leading Democratic politician in the US. Because somebody arranged this meeting, they thought this guy, he's a progressive, would be interested in modern monetary theory. And they had a long meeting, and Stephanie talks about it in the book, and I've included this little quote here. For the first time, the congressman was seeing the world through an MMT lens, and things had just come into focus. Just earlier, she says he'd been listening to Warren for ages, and then suddenly a light went on in his eyes. His posture became more confident, and then he leaned forward, clasped his eyes, looked Warren in the eye, and softly said, I can't say that. And that's the job that I have for you, every last one of you, and me too, and Phil and Gabby and all of us. We need to make it safe for politicians to say that. And what Phil was just saying, who cares about GDP? I don't think there's an elected member of the Greens that would say that in public.
Mm.
We need to
Likewise,
make it, yeah.
how are you going to pay for it?
Exactly, they wouldn't.
Taxpayers' money.
We need to make it safe for politicians to have these discussions. And Stephanie's been talking to politicians in the US, I know for a fact, about the genuine progress indicator, just to go back to Phil and what he was saying before. But we need to broaden the discussion as much as we can, get as many people as we can to read the book and to chat about the book, because we need to get our lens right, to bring all these things together. Because the future needs to be a little bit Phil Lorne and a little bit Stephanie Kelton. And they go very well together. An ecological perspective, a sustainability perspective, and modern monetary theory. And as Stephanie says towards the end of the book, if our generation continues to use the wrong lens, we will not make the right investments at the scale and pace needed to avert ever greater social and ecological crises. This is the most important time in human history. We are living in it right now. The good news is that we now have the right lens, and that lens is MMT. You know some, and she's one of them, Stephanie. Let's just focus on Stephanie. Stephanie, in my opinion, is one of the most important people in the history of the world. And you and I have an opportunity to, I think, actually save our civilization and make a huge difference to the future of our species. And I think this book is an enormously powerful tool to help us do that, which is why I agree with Naomi Klein. And you can read that for yourself. And that was it, really.
Thank you, Stephen. Gosh. Deep breaths. Can we give you a round of applause? Thank you.
Oh, that's very nice. Well, we should give Gabby a round of applause. Actually, would everybody give Gabby a round? We did this last week, but we should do it again, because Gabrielle Baum, you're a legend. There is nobody else in this state that could have done what you've done.
Thank you, very much appreciated. I'm glad everybody's still here. I have a few, just dates for your diary. Tori had a question. Was it about the presentation or about something else?
No, it was about, it was a broader question related to the presentation. But I can ask it some other time, but I just feel we have a huge cultural issue to deal with, a huge cultural and political issue. And I think we kind of need to prepare for that as well, because it's not just about rethinking capitalism, because the 0.1% are trying to bring back feudalism, basically, is what they're trying to do. They're trying to take all the power and run the political parties. So we have an enormous problem that goes back even before capitalism, I think, that we need to deal with. Just saying,
Yeah.
Absolutely agreed.
That was David Olney's thesis in his talk as well. So I think at this point I might stop the recording, because we're going to start just talk about a little bit about what's coming up, which won't be relevant for people listening back to this in the future. So I'll stop the recording there.